Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. Elias Thorne always assumed death was silent. His grandfather, S. Will, however, was anything but. It was a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to come not from the air, but from the very bone beneath his feet. The house was called Oacaven, a name that suggested rustic tranquility, but delivered oppressive, gothic gloom. It wasn't tea just old. It felt used up, as if decades of human anxiety had leached into the timber and plaster. Elias had inherited it, along with a sealed letter and the specific instruction that he must occupy the premises for 7 consecutive nights before the deed was legally his. He pulled his rental car up the long, cracked driveway, the tires crunching on gravel, in what felt like an insult to the stillness. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the light was strangely muted, a perpetual, bruised twilight where the shadows were not black, but an endless, sickly violet. The front door, heavy oak scarred by time and weather, wasn't T-locked. It yielded with a groan that sounded less like friction and more like a whispered complaint inside. The air was cold, dry, and impossibly stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone and dust. The foyer was vast, dominated by a spiral staircase whose banister twisted upwards like a skeletal spine vanishing into darkness. The furniture, covered in starched white drop cloths, resembled a silent, shrouded audience waiting for a play that would never start. Elias set down his duffel bag. The hum intensified here, low and steady, a vibration deep in the chest. He pulled out the sealed letter from his coat pocket. His grandfather, Silas Thorne, had been a brilliant, eccentric theoretical physicist who had vanished 5 years ago, leaving behind only this impossible house. Elias broke the brittle wax seal and unfolded the thick, creamy paper. The script was elegant yet shaky. Elias, if you are reading this, I have failed to stop it. Oakhaven is not a place, it is a mechanism. It is a coil. Do not attempt to fix the clocks. They are all broken, yes, but they are broken by design. They measure what is finite. What resides here is not. There is a room you must never enter. It is the chamber behind the mirror on the 3rd floor landing. The one with the cracked silvering. Do not look into the crack for too long, and for God's sake, do not listen for the tick. You must observe, and you must not, under any circumstances, try to remember what you ate for breakfast or what you said yesterday. Repetition is the fuel. I am sorry. There is no time left. Elias frowned, crumpling the letter slowly. It sounded less like a final testament and more like the ramblings of a man lost to dementia. He tossed it onto a dusty marble side table. Repetition is the fuel, he muttered. Great. He spent the next hour securing the ground floor. Every window was latched, every heavy curtain pulled across. He found a strange uniformity. Every grandfather clock in the house, and there were at least 5 on the 1st floor alone, was stopped at precisely 3:07. Upstairs the silence was thicker, pressing against his eardrums. He found a 3rd floor landing, a narrow, dusty space overlooking the foyer, and there was the mirror. It was immense, framed in tarnished, heavy bronze, leaning slightly against the wall. The silvering was deeply cracked, a jagged line running from the top right corner down to the center, creating a splintered reflection of the shadowy hallway. Elias approached slowly, driven by the morbid curiosity his grandfather had both warned against and fostered. He peered into the crack. The fractured reflection was deep, just distorted. It was wrong. In the tiny sliver of glass directly beneath the crack, he saw not the hallway, but a fleeting flash of brilliant, impossible white sunlight, a light that hadn't touched Oakhaven since he arrived. Then the sound. It wasn't the hum. This was closer, sharper, and deeply rhythmic. A fast, insistent tick-tock, tick-tock. It seemed to emanate directly from the wall behind the mirror. Ignoring the warning in the crumpled letter downstairs, Elias ran his hand along the wall beside the bronze frame. His fingers brushed against a barely visible seam in the wood paneling. He pushed, and with a soft click, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a gap just wide enough for a shoulder. He pulled out his phone flashlight. The passage led down 3 narrow, stone steps into a small, windowless room. The air here was even colder, and the metallic ozone smell was overpowering. The room was sparse. A single, high-backed wooden chair, a stack of blank, page notebooks, and resting on a small round table in the center, a device. It was a large, brass metronome, not a clock, but a timekeeper designed for rhythm, not chronology. Its pendulum was a slender, silver rod with a weighted inverted triangle at the top. It was swinging with maniacal speed, perfectly centered on the table. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The humming underneath the floor was now a roar in his ears. Elias felt a sudden, profound nausea, the floor seeming to tilt beneath him. He reached out a hand, intending to stop the frantic brass arm. As his fingertips neared the pendulum, the rhythm abruptly shifted. It stuttered. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Tock then settled into a slow, agonizingly familiar beat. It was the steady, heavy thump of his own heart. He snatched his hand back. On the small table next to the metronome lay a single, open notebook. The paper was clean, but a single sentence was written across the top of the first page in his grandfather, Fa's unmistakable hand. I have been writing this for 5 days. I cannot stop the pen from moving. Elias felt a cold dread clamped down on his lungs. The metronome's rhythmic beat, his own pulse externalized, seemed to mock him. He looked at the inscription again, then at the sealed letter he had just read downstairs. 5 days. But the letter had been sent weeks ago, sealed and filed by the estate attorney. He backed out of the room, fumbling for the hidden door. As he stepped onto the 3rd floor landing, he looked back at the metronome. In the pale beam of his flashlight, the brass seemed to shimmer, and for a fleeting, sickening second, the small inverted triangle at the top of the pendulum looked less like a weight and more like the sharp, open jaw of a terrible, waiting mouth. He slammed the panel shut and leaned against the cold wall, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the steady, mocking tick. Talk that was now muffled, but still distinctly present. He had to get his things and leave. The 7 days be damned. He ran down the 2 flights of stairs and stopped abruptly in the foyer. The crumpled letter he had tossed on the marble side table was gone. The side table was clean, covered only in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust, and in the center of the table, resting neatly on a starched white drop cloth that had not been there before, was a sealed, unblemished envelope with the familiar, thick wax seal waiting for him. Elias reached out and picked it up. His name in his grandfather's elegant, shaky script was written on the front. He broke the seal. He unfolded the paper. The words were identical. Elias, if you are reading this, I have failed to stop it. He checked his watch. It was 4 p.m. He had been in the house for over an hour. He looked across the foyer at the nearest grandfather clock. It was stopped as before at 3:07, but now, for the first time, he saw something etched faintly into the wood of the clock. S base right below the brass pendulum case. He checked his watch again. 4 p.m. It was impossible. He had spent at least an hour and a half in the house. The initial search, the morbid fascination with the metronome, the sprint back down the stairs. By any logical measure, it should be closer to 5:30 p.m. He had to see his car. If time had truly coiled back on itself, the tires would not show the fresh crunch marks of his arrival. He flung the great oak door open. It yielded with the exact same drawn-out, painful groan as before. A sound that, having heard it once, felt like a pre-recorded insult the second time. Outside, the light was the same bruised, sickly violet. He ran down the cracked driveway. His rental sedan was parked perfectly where he had left it, but the gravel around the tires was pristine. The stones were settled, undisturbed, as if the car had materialized there seconds ago, rather than being driven. He threw his duffel bag from the trunk, scattering the contents onto the cold, damp earth. A laptop, a change of clothes, a travel-sized bottle of cheap whiskey. He debought for courage. He stared at the contents, then slammed the trunk shut. "No," he whispered, the sound immediately swallowed by Oakhaven. Heavy silence. Not again. He snatched up his laptop, intending to film the whole thing, to document the impossibility. As his fingers gripped the cold aluminum, a wave of profound dizziness washed over him. The world tilted, and the low-frequency hum that permeated the house seemed to spike into a blinding high pitch in his inner ear. His grandfather's warning flashed in his mind. Repetition is the fuel. He dropped the laptop and stumbled back toward the house. His first cycle had been one of observation and curiosity. This second cycle would be one of rebellion. He needed proof of the previous iteration, something that could not be reset. He ran back into the foyer. The fresh letter lay on the starched drop cloth. Elias bypassed it. He grabbed a heavy bronze vase from the nearest stand, its surface cold and dusty, and heaved it with all his strength against the nearest wall. Crash! The sound was shockingly loud, a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. The wall where the vase struck was plaster overlaid, and the impact left a deep, spiderweb crack radiating outward from the point of contact. The vase itself clattered onto the floor, its bell bottom dented and chipped. There, an act of permanent violence. The loop could erase a structural defect. He pocketed the sealed letter, the one that had been waiting for him, and ascended the spiral staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. The hum in the house seemed to vibrate faster, almost excitedly, beneath his feet, like a hungry machine anticipating its meal. He reached the 3rd floor landing and found the great cracked mirror. The jagged fissure was exactly as he remembered, reflecting the distorted hallway. He checked the hidden panel. It was sealed shut. He pushed the seam. Click. The door swung inward. Elias descended the 3 stone steps, phone flashlight ready. The small, windowless chamber was identical. The high, backed chair, the stack of notebooks, and the round table in the center. The brass metronome was there, but its silver pendulum arm was motionless, resting against the magnetized base. The oppressive tick-tock was gone. The room was utterly silent save for the ever-present, grinding hum. He approached the table. He picked up the notebook. The paper was clean. The terrifying line written in Silas' hand. "I have been writing this for 5 days. I cannot stop the pen from moving. was gone. Elias yanked a ballpoint pen from his coat pocket. He needed to leave a marker, something that would exist outside the memory of the house. He pressed the pen to the clean page and scrawled, in huge, frantic letters, smashed foyer wall. He underlined it 3 times, snapped the notebook shut, and shoved it underneath the metronome. S brass housing. He then backed out of the room, closed the panel, and raced back down to the foyer, descending the stairs with a clumsy, panicked momentum. He skidded to a stop on the polished marble floor of the foyer. The wall was flawless. The plaster was smooth, painted in the same faded, greenish hue as the rest of the room. There was no spiderweb crack. There were no shards of bronze on the floor. The vase was back on its stand, dusting lightly, pristine and undented. The house had not only reset time, it had reset matter. Elias leaned against the newly restored wall, breathing hard, trying to process the absolute physical impossibility. He was trapped in a temporal bubble, a recurring moment between 3:07 p.m. and whenever the coil decided to snap back. And the coil had snapped back when he had been outside. By the car, he looked around. The grandfather clock still showed 3:07. He walked over and ripped open the clock. S-glass door. He ran his finger over the wooden base, right beneath the pendulum. The etching was still there, faint but unmistakable. The house had reset, but the tally had not. The mechanism knew he had completed cycle 1. He needed to survive the rest of this cycle, cycle 2, and prevent the machine from reaching 30. He pulled out the sealed letter from his pocket, the one he, Day, grabbed fresh on this cycle. You must observe, and you must not, under any circumstances, try to remember what you ate for breakfast or what you said yesterday. He knew what his grandfather was describing, the self-referential paradox. The loop was sensitive to his own consciousness. If he consciously repeated his actions or dwelling on the specific memories of the prior loop, he became a source of fuel. If cycle 1 had been defined by curiosity, cycle 2 needed to be defined by avoidance. Elias walked slowly to the kitchen, a cavernous, tiled room at the back of the house. The windows were too high to see out of, but the room itself was well lit by a large antique lantern. He found a flask of water and a packet of energy bars in his duffel bag. He chose the sitting room for the night, a place far from the stairs and the metronome room. He dragged a heavy sofa away from the wall, checking for any hidden panels or vents. The hum in here was weaker, just a low thrum that felt like a distant idling engine. As dusk began to truly settle, the light outside shifted from bruised violet to an inky, absolute black. The hum intensified again, forcing its way through the walls, vibrating the leather of the sofa he sat on. He decided to run a controlled experiment on the memory rule. He closed his eyes. What did I see exactly when I looked into the crack of the mirror? Immediately, a piercing, icy pain drove itself through his temples. It wasn't just a headache. It felt like a sharp object was being pressed through his skull. He gasped, dropping the flask. He opened his eyes. The pain receded instantly, leaving behind a cold sweat. The house seemed to settle, the hum dropping in pitch, momentarily satisfied. The mechanism does not want me to remember. Remembering means creating a thread of continuity, and continuity breaks the loop. It's perfect repetition. He must act differently, but without intentionally remembering what he had done before. An impossible, paradoxical task. He had to be spontaneous, yet avoid the spontaneous path he had already taken. The night passed slowly, filled with the constant, grinding pressure of the house. Low hum. Elias didn't sleep. He sat on the sofa, staring at the drop cloths, watching for movement. At one point, he heard a sound from the floor above, a soft, wet squelch, followed by a slow, dragging sound. He froze, listening. The dragging noise seemed to move toward the spiral staircase, and then silence. He spent the rest of the night rigid with fear, the flashlight clutched in his hand. He checked his watch every 10 minutes. The hands moved. Time, at least in the small context of his wrist, was still functioning. Around 2 a.m., the humming became louder, reaching the pitch of a distant industrial turbine. The air in the room grew colder, and the ozone smell returned, sharp and acidic, stinging his nostrils. He knew the climax of the loop was approaching. He waited, heart pounding, for 3:07 a.m., the time where every clock in Oakhaven had stopped. But his watch kept moving. 3:08, 3:09, 3:10. The time was irrelevant to the house. Cycle 3:07 was a timestamp, not the trigger. He knew it was about to happen. He had to be different. He had to disrupt his own ending. He stood up, grabbed his duffel bag, and sprinted back toward the front door. He would get in his car and drive away before the house could snap him back. He yanked open the heavy oak door. It groaned, the same sound. But this time, it was laced with a palpable, almost human sigh of disappointment. He was out on the porch running for the driveway. The gravel was waiting. He saw the car. He reached the driver's side door, his hand fumbling for the handle, and then the light changed. It didn't fade. It snapped. The inky black of the pre-dawn night instantly became the bruised, sickly twilight of 4 o'clock. Elias froze, his hand inches from the car door. The gravel around the tires settled. The faint indentations his shoes had just made vanished, the stones smoothing themselves out as if they were covered in water. He dropped his duffel bag again. It landed with a soft, synthetic thud. The heavy oak front door of Oakhaven slowly, relentlessly groaned shut behind him. Elias turned, dread settling into the marrow of his bones. He walked back inside, the floor beneath the marble feeling strangely new beneath his feet. There was the marble side table. There was the clean drop cloth. And there, resting perfectly in the center, was the unblemished wax sealed letter. He ignored it. He walked straight to the grandfather clock he had checked last. He reached past the static pendulum. The faint etching was still there, but now it was deeper, clearer, and unnervingly confident. The house had reset. His memory, though painful to access, remained, and the coil had tightened one more degree. This was no dream, no hallucination. This was an incremental, building horror. He was not just repeating time, he was ascending a staircase made of identical moments, and with each step, the structure grew stronger. He looked at his watch. 4 p.m. Elias leaned his forehead against the cold wood of the clock case. He had to get to the metronome chamber. He had to check his note. If it was gone, the house didn't just reset the physical world. It reset Silas. Warning. If it was still there, however, then perhaps his grandfather had found a way to leave a trace outside the coil. He began the ascent up the spiral staircase, his feet moving on the same steps, in the same direction. For the third time, this time, the low hum was accompanied by a subtle new sound, a dry, scraping whisper that seemed to ride the ambient vibration. Repetition is the fuel. Elias did not wait for the door to close this time. He was already moving. Fear, having cycled and intensified, had curdled into a cold, ruthless resolve. The low hum of the house, that constant, oppressive chord, felt less like background noise and more like the sound of his own blood. It was inside him now. The sealed letter lay on the side table, 4 p.m. He had 5 cycles before 3:07 p.m., before whatever mechanism triggered the final snap. He he'd afford to waste a single second observing the horror. He had to violate the house. S rules differently each time, seeking a point of friction, a glitch in the cosmic reel. He sprinted up the spiral staircase, his grandfather's warning. You must not, under any circumstances, try to remember what you ate for breakfast or what you said yesterday, was the key. Repetition provided the fuel, and memory was the map of repetition. He had to act on instinct and pure, aggressive difference. When he reached the 3rd floor landing, he noticed a subtle change, an acceleration of the dread. The great bronze, framed mirror with its jagged crack, seemed to exhale a chill that was deeper than the rest of the house. He didn't look into the crack. The fleeting flash of impossible sunlight from the first cycle was a memory he didn't dare access. He shoved at the wall seam. Click. He slipped inside the hidden chamber. The small, windowless room was exactly as he had left it in the first cycle, and exactly as he had found it in the second. High, backed chair, stack of notebooks, small round table. The brass metronome stood motionless. The sound, however, was different. It wasn't the insane tick, talk of cycle 1, nor the absolute silence of the room in cycle 2. Now, it was a profound, deep sound, slow and labored, originating deep within the wall itself. Talk, 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 talk. It sounded like a massive subterranean heart beating once every 10 seconds. Elias lunged for the metronome. He lifted the brass housing. His frantic note from cycle 2, smashed foyer wall, was gone. The area beneath the metronome was simply dusty wood. The house had erased his confession, proving that any action, even within the hidden chamber, was subject to the reset. The only thing that carried over was the count, the tally. He needed to create a variable that the house could not erase because it was outside the immediate area of the loop. Focus. He needed a secure path. He grabbed one of the blank notebooks from the stack in his pen. In the center of the first page, he drew a crude, angular map of the 3 floors, labeling the points of interest. Foyer, 3:07, clock, count, 3rd floor, landing, mirror entry, metronome room. He added a simple line, cycle 3. Check basement. He tore the map out of the book. Where to hide it? He couldn't leave it in the room. He couldn't leave it in the foyer. He needed to plant it outside the house. His current sphere of influence, maybe on his body. He crammed the folded paper into the lining of his coat, stitching it roughly into the inner seam using a loose thread and a small sewing kit. He brought for emergencies. It was clumsy, but if the house reset his clothes, at least he would know the physical change was not permanent. He backed out, closing the panel firmly. He knew the house was watching, feeding on the methodical nature of his resistance. Downstairs, he passed the grandfather clock. He checked the etching. 3 of 30, it was confirmed. 30 cycles. 30 increasingly distorted versions of the same afternoon, leading to some final, unimaginable event. He remembered his grandfather's line, "Do not attempt to fix the clocks. They are all broken, yes, but they are broken by design. They measure what is finite. What resides here is not." The clocks frozen at 3:07 were a red herring, a distraction that pointed to linear time. The real mechanism was the metronome, the device that measured rhythm. The house wasn't trapped in a minute. It was trapped in a beat. Elias realized the true purpose of the metronome. It was a chronometer not of time, but of suffering. In cycle 1, it beat his heart as frantic rhythm. The house had literally measured his terror. He had to keep his emotions flat, his actions unpredictable, to deny the machine its rhythm. He decided on the basement. His focus in the last 2 cycles had been the front door and the metronome. This cycle, he would violate the pattern by going down into the deepest part of the structure. The entrance to the basement was a heavy, bolted wooden door hidden off the kitchen. The metal bolt was rusted shut. He needed leverage. He walked past the restored wall of the foyer and into the sitting room. There, he saw a familiar object he de-used last cycle, the heavy bronze vase. He resisted the urge to use it again. Don't to repeat the action, don't to provide the fuel. Instead, he found the fireplace poker, long, heavy, and soot-stained. The hum intensified when he touched it, a clear sign of the house's displeasure at the introduction of a new aggressive variable. He returned to the basement door and jammed the sharp end of the poker under the rusted bolt. He leveraged his weight, pulling back with a grunt. The metal squealed, protesting with a sound that mirrored the house's low hum, then snapped free. The basement door fell open with a hollow thump. A smell wafted up that was unlike the metallic ozone of the metronome room or the dust of the foyer. It was the smell of damp earth, rot, and something profoundly sweet, like burnt sugar. Elias turned on his phone flashlight and descended the crumbling, uneven steps. The basement was a vast, low, ceilinged crypt supported by thick stone pillars. The floor covered in a layer of thick black sludge that glistened in the light. It wasn't tea water. It was viscous and strangely reflective. As he moved deeper, his flashlight beam swept across the pillars. They weren't tea smooth stone. They were covered in thick, spiraling carvings, hundreds of names etched into the rock, covered and obscured by the dark ooze. He stopped at the central pillar, the only one not coated in sludge. Here, the carvings were crisp and recent. He read the topmost name, Silas Thorne, 29 of 30. His grandfather hadn't just occupied the house. He had completed 29 cycles. He had made it to the brink of the final 30th day. And then he had vanished. A memory, sharp and agonizing, tried to claw its way into Elias' consciousness. Silas' frantic final phone call. He gasped, clutching his head as the familiar icy spike of pain erupted in his temples. Dawn, remember the call. Dawn, remember the call. He focused on the etchings. Each name had a number next to it, always rising incrementally, always ending in of 30. This wasn't just a house. It was a cyclical prison that had been harvesting occupants for decades, forcing them to run the 30 loops until they hit the final, fatal count. Elias dropped the poker. He didn't need to check the foyer clock anymore. The cycle counter wasn't just on the clock. It was built into the history of the house, a monument to the failures of everyone before him. He looked back up at his grandfather. Name, 29. If Silas had completed cycle 29, what happened on cycle 30? He scanned the pillar further down. His flashlight beam landed on a name he faintly recognized from an old family album. Jonathan Thorne, 25 of 30. His great-uncle. Gone 60 years. He realized the true horror. He wasn't just Elias Thorne, the current inhabitant. He was the next Thorne who had to run the full 30 cycle. The house was not random. It was familial. As he turned to leave the horrifying crypt, he saw it, an inscription carved at floor level, half submerged in the thick black sludge. It was written not in a name, but in a symbol, a complex interlocking spiral. 3 loops connected at the center, and next to it, 0 of 30, the beginning, the first sacrifice, the true foundation of Oakhaven as terrible machine. He scrambled back up the steps, adrenaline overriding his mounting panic. He kicked the basement door shut and threw the heavy bolt, sealing the horror below. He leaned against the kitchen counter, heart hammering the same frantic rhythm. He heard from the metronome and cycle. 1. He knew now what the house wanted, the completion of the count. He checked his watch. 4:45 p.m. Time was marching on. He had violated his pattern successfully, but he had also confirmed the danger. He knew what was coming next. The agonizing drag of the night, the intensifying hum, and the inescapable loop snap at the end. He reached up to the seam of his coat and felt the slight bulge of the notebook paper. He had successfully created his variable, his external marker. Now, he had to survive the next 10 hours and make it to the 4th cycle, when his true deliberate resistance could begin. But as he looked out the high kitchen window, a flicker of light caught his eye. It wasn't the bruised twilight. It was the white, impossibly bright flash of sunlight, the light he had only seen reflected in the cracked mirror on the 3rd floor. It was here now, outside, and with the light, the hum of the house abruptly ceased. Oakhaven went utterly, terrifyingly silent. Elias froze, breath held. In the sudden vacuum of sound, he heard the faint, dry, scraping whisper, no longer distant, but standing right behind him. Repetition is the fuel, and I'm running low. He spun around, the fireplace poker clattering to the tile floor. The kitchen was empty, but on the counter, next to his energy bars, lay a single, thin strand of long, white hair, glistening faintly in the impossible white light. The transition between cycles was no longer instantaneous. It was a physical tearing. As the sickly white light of the imminent snap faded and the familiar, bruised twilight of 4 p.m. returned, Elias felt a violent lurch in his stomach, as if his internal organs had been violently wrung out. He stood on the driveway gravel, his breath rasping in the cold air. The heavy oak door of Oakhaven, which had grown shut on him moments before, was now closed, silent and sealed. He did look at the pristine gravel, nor did he look at his duffel bag, which had materialized back in the trunk. His focus was singular, his movement driven by a terrible, cold hope, the coat. He ripped his heavy coat off and plunged his fingers into the lining of the inner seam. The hasty, clumsy stitching he had done in cycle 3, the one he used to hide his location map, was still intact. The house had reset the walls, the clocks, the vase, and the kitchen counter, but it had failed to reset his personal effects, or, crucially, the physical alterations he made to his own garment. With trembling urgency, he pulled the thread free. The folded paper map, showing the 3 floors and the note cycle 3, check basement, was there. He crumpled the letter he picked up in the last cycle and threw it into the rhododendrons, variable secured. He ran to the foyer grandfather clock, ignoring the sealed letter on the side table. He didn't even register the house. S persistent hum. This time, he was too focused on the tally. He peered into the glass door. Beneath the 307 pendulum, the number was clearer, deeper, carved with the authority of a terrible history. 4 of 30, he had successfully survived 3 cycles. He had 26 left. Each one was a step closer to Silas, his fate, yet also a step toward the knowledge Silas had hidden. The key was to act randomly, but with a predetermined, non-repetitive plan. Cycle 1, curiosity, failure due to pattern recognition and fear. Cycle 2, destruction, failure due to matter reset. Cycle 3, investigation, success in finding the basement crypt and the variable anchor. Cycle 4, documentation and insight. He knew that entering the metronome room was now a form of repetition. Checking the basement was repetition. He needed a new area. Silas Thorne, the theoretical physicist, must have had a study or a lab. Elias remembered a set of double doors off the main dining hall he had ignored in the first 3 cycles. He headed straight there, carrying his laptop and his newly rescued, now crucial map. The double doors led into a massive library. It was colder than the rest of the house, lined floor, too, ceiling with packed bookshelves, the smell of decaying paper overwhelming the metallic ozone. A thin layer of frost coated the spines of the leather. Bound books. He moved quickly, pulling books off shelves at random, searching for loose papers or a hidden vault. The house responded immediately. The low hum, which had been steady, began to distort, wavering, like a speaker straining under too much bass. Then the sound came. It wasn't the slow, subterranean talk of the basement, nor the sharp tick, talk of the metronome. This was the static echo. It was a babble of voices, faint and confusing, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the plaster held all the auditory waste of the house. As previous loops, he heard whispers of fear, the sound of a woman crying, a man shouting an equation, all overlapping and unintelligible, like tuning between radio stations. These were the failures, the echoes of those who hadn't to survive the count. The house was running low on fuel, but the static was the residue of the fuel it had consumed. Elias pressed his hands over his ears, fighting the urge to fall to his knees. The noise wasn't just sound, it was emotional pollution, designed to break his resolve. He forced himself to ignore it, focusing only on the shelves. Finally, behind a row of heavy, forgotten Latin texts, he found a loose section of shelving. He pulled it open. Behind it was a narrow niche containing a single leather-bound book that looked different from the rest. It was a research journal. He pulled it out. The cover was blank, save for a small metallic symbol etched into the leather, the same interlocking spiral he had seen carved in the basement, the one marked 0 of 30. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with Silas Thorne's precise academic script. Entry, day 17, cycle unknown. The house is a device for temporal recursion. It does not rewind. It merely initiates a new coil, using the residual memory and patterns of the previous inhabitant as energy. The 30 cycles are not a limit, but a stabilization phase, a tuning fork. At C-30, the loop becomes self-sustaining and the observer is permanently absorbed, their consciousness becoming the static echo. Entry, day 24. Cycle 26. I have been here too long. My memories are dangerous. The only way to confuse the chronometer is to introduce dimensional bleed. The flash of light I saw in the mirror crack, the window, is a brief glimpse of linear time. The entity is starving and trying to use my own mind as the entry point. I must leave a clean break. The next Thorn must understand. The only constants are the tally and the variable you create. Nothing else is real. The white hair, it is not mine. It is the antenna. Elias slammed the journal shut, his mind reeling. The white hair on the kitchen counter in cycle 3 was the entity. Us antenna, a physical intrusion meant to establish a connection just before the loop reset, a way to harvest his memories and ensure pattern recognition. The white light was dimensional bleed, the world outside, trying to assert itself before being violently pulled back into Oakhaven's rhythm. He had to get rid of the antenna. He glanced at his watch. 4:45 p.m. Time was still flowing, but he knew the moment of high risk, the period just before the loop snapped, usually in the late hours of the night. He rushed back toward the kitchen, gripping the journal tightly. The static echo followed him, its overlapping whispers increasing in volume until it sounded like 1,000 dying souls shrieking at once. In the kitchen, he went straight to the counter where the hair had appeared in the last cycle. It was clean, polished wood. He ran his hand over it. Nothing. He was right. The antenna only appeared in cycle 3, when his emotional state was at its peak, frustration over the basement revelation and the memory pain. He had to deny the house that emotional peak in cycle 4. He grabbed a heavy butcher knife from a block. Another variable, something he hadn't touched before. He shoved the journal into his coat lining, securing it roughly with his map. He would take no chances with its security. He then moved to the center of the kitchen, turning his back to the high window where the white light had appeared. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, the knife resting gently on the tile, and forced himself to breathe deeply. Deny the rhythm. Deny the pattern. The hum outside the room intensified into a frantic, physical vibration, rattling the cupboards. The static echo became deafening, an overwhelming chorus of pain and confusion. The house was trying to drive him insane, forcing him to repeat the actions of panic that would lead to his mental exhaustion and eventual consumption. Elias closed his eyes and tried to remember his grandfather, his face, a deliberate violation of the memory rule. He braced for the searing pain. It hit him instantly, a crushing, unbearable pressure on his eyeballs, the feeling of his skull cracking. He let out a suppressed cry, sweat immediately breaking out on his forehead. But he held the memory, Silas, smiling, holding a fishing rod on a lake he had never been to. The memory felt clean, vibrant, a source of resistance, not fuel. The house recoiled. The hum dropped to a low thrum. The static echo abruptly ceased. The room fell into a silence, so profound it was painful. He opened his eyes. The white light was back outside the high kitchen window, stronger this time, washing the room in a clinical, harsh luminescence. And there it was, on the polished wooden counter, not one strand of hair, but a small, shimmering clump of white, fine hair. Elias grabbed the knife, and without hesitation, scraped the hair off the counter and onto the blade. He carried the blade to the stove, turned the gas on, and ignited the white strands. The hair didn't burn. It vaporized instantly, releasing a puff of ozone and a flash of blinding white light that filled the kitchen. When the light receded, the gas flame was gone. The stove was cold, and standing in the doorway, blocking his exit, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, shrouded in shadow, its edges blurring against the faint outline of the foyer light. It wasn't Silas, or any person he knew. It was a silhouette composed entirely of flickering, static white light, like a broken television screen, given skeletal form. It didn't move. It simply stood, and from its depths, the dry, scraping whisper emerged, no longer accusatory, but mournful. You should have listened, Elias. Now you cannot leave. Now you are mine forever. The world snapped. The impossible white light was gone, replaced by the bruised twilight. The kitchen was normal. The butcher knife was back in the block, and the stove was cold and untouched. Elias stood in the middle of the kitchen. He felt weak, his knees shaking. He looked down at his watch, 4 p.m. He walked slowly back to the foyer, dread mixing with the exhilaration of knowing he was now a tangible threat to the house. He reached the grandfather clock and ran his finger over the case. 5 of 30, he had survived another cycle. The mechanism was counting, and the house was growing, desperate. He had seen the entity, the static man, and he knew its weakness, the variable of his action, and the truth of his grandfather, Seth's journal. He looked at the sealed letter on the side table. He didn't pick it up this time. He just looked at the neat, familiar address. "You are wrong," Elias whispered to the empty room, clutching the newly secured journal in his coat lining. "I am still here, and I'm going to break your rhythm. I hope this chapter provided the intensity and horror you were looking for." Elias has established a physical variable outside the house as control and has confronted the entity responsible for the loop. Would you like to continue to Chapter 5, focusing on using the journal as knowledge to seek out the window on the 3rd floor and initiate a dimensional bleed escape attempt? The jolt was brutal. This time, the loop snap was not just a transition of light, but a physical shockwave. Elias was thrown against the doorframe of the kitchen, his ears ringing with the phantom shriek of the static man. He tasted blood where his teeth had snapped against his tongue. He pushed off the doorframe, his legs rubbery. The kitchen was reset, knife in the block, stove cold. The terrifying clump of white hair was gone, the counter immaculate. His watch read 4 p.m. He stumbled to the foyer, ignoring the freshly sealed letter. He plunged his hand into the lining of his coat. Beneath the hasty, crude stitching, the edge of Silas' journal met his fingers. His heart hammered a desperate, erratic rhythm against his ribs. Variable secured. He walked to the grandfather clock. The wood felt impossibly cold beneath his touch. He ran his hand over the pendulum base. 5 of 30, the tally was now a physical fact, a relentless countdown stamped by the cyclical trauma. He had 25 more days to go, 25 more opportunities for the house to consume him, or 25 more chances to escape. Cycle 5, initiate dimensional bleed. He had to get to the 3rd floor. Silas' journal entry was stark, the crack in the great mirror on the 3rd. Floor landing was the window, a point of weakness where the loop had failed to completely seal itself, allowing brief glimpses of linear time. To force a bleed, he needed to create a memory vortex right at the point of contact. This meant violating the memory rule not accidentally, but intentionally, and sustaining the resulting pain long enough to rip the fabric of the loop. As Elias began his ascent of the spiral staircase, the atmosphere of the house changed drastically. It was no longer humming, it was listening. Every step he took on the worn wood seemed to echo 5 times, mocking his slow, careful pace. The static echo, which had been a chorus of distant suffering, was now a constant, low, grade murmur, clinging to the edges of his hearing. Don't you look. Don't to go up. Turn back, it hurts." The whispers scraped across the silence. He pushed on, his hand gripping the cold banister, his knuckles white. When he reached the 3rd floor landing, the air was glacial. The great bronze mirror hung on the wall, its cracked surface absorbing and distorting the twilight from the hallway. Elias stopped 6 feet away from it. He didn't want to get too close before he was ready. He opened Silas' journal, flipping to the final entry. "The entity is starving and trying to use my own mind as the entry point. I must leave a clean break. The next thorn must understand. The only constants are the tally and the variable you create. Nothing else is real," he understood. The static man was not a physical demon. It was a hungry self, aware algorithm that ran the loop. It needed Elias, his memories, his consciousness, to fill the emptiness of the new cycle by intentionally invoking a specific traumatic memory. While near the dimensional fault line, he would overload the machine's consumption process. Elias approached the mirror. The jagged crack ran like a lightning strike across the bronze frame, a perfect fissure in the dimensional continuity. He looked into the glass. The reflection staring back was not his own. The figure in the reflection was impossibly thin, stretched and wavering, composed entirely of that shifting television, static light. It was the static man, but it wasn't T simply reflecting him. It was standing where Elias was standing, mimicking his posture, a translucent phantom layered over his own body. Its whisper was not external, it was internal, a cold, dry thought burrowing into his mind. Four times you came this way. Do not make it 5, Elias. The pain is not worth the view. The static man was using the memory of the previous cycles against him, preemptively trying to instill the dread that would lead to paralysis and ultimately repetition. Elias closed the journal, ignoring the pain already beginning to prickle behind his eyes. He forced himself to move closer to the mirror until his chest was inches from the cold glass. He had to remember the trauma. Not just any trauma, but the specific moment the loop targeted most violently, the phone call. He closed his eyes, bracing himself. He focused on the memory of receiving the final, frantic call from Silas, days before he came to Oakhaven. Silas's voice was high, pitched, desperate. Elias, listen to me. I haven't slept in 28 days. The house resets everything. The metronome measures the cycle. They re-coming. When you find my letter, Elias, promise me you won. Look. The pain was immediate and excruciating. It felt like 10,000 volts of static electricity driving spikes into his brain. Elias staggered, his knees buckling, but he forced his hands onto the cold, unforgiving surface of the glass, pressing his forehead against the crack. 1. Look at the crack in the mirror. It draws the eye. It has the gateway. As the memory peaked, the glass beneath his hand began to vibrate. It wasn't just shaking, it was shivering violently, generating its own sound. A high, pitched whine of metal shearing metal. Elias shoved his face closer, forcing his eye directly against the crack. Dimensional bleed. For one crystalline, blinding second, the bruised twilight vanished. In its place, Elias saw a real, impossible image, a clear, sunny afternoon. Green grass, not the dead brown he had seen. A bird singing, its song impossibly loud and vibrant, and a bright, deep blue sky. He saw a car, not his rental, but a pristine, cherry, red convertible driving down a clean asphalt road. It was the linear, real world, but the beautiful image was marred, stretched across the sunlight, acting like a filter on the view, was the immense, wavering outline of the static man. It was standing on the other side of the crack, its light, composed hands pressed flat against the glass barrier, attempting to push through the bleed. He could see its face now. If it could be called a face, it was a shimmering void, but it was contorting, trying to scream into the memory vortex. You can't. You cannot resist the rhythm. You are part of the count. You belong to the end. The thought echoed, raw and panicked, in Elias's mind. Elias used the last ounce of his strength to scream back, not aloud, but in thought, pouring every ounce of his hatred and resistance into the vortex. I am not your fuel, the energy discharged. The mirror exploded. It didn't shatter into thousands of shards. Instead, The entire reflection, the glass, the frame, the image of the static man, imploded inward with a terrifying sucking sound, leaving behind a perfectly clean, smooth, plaster wall where the mirror had been moments before. The only evidence left was a large burn mark on the floor, directly beneath where the mirror had hung. The house recoiled violently. The floor lurched. Elias was thrown against the banister. The bruised twilight snapped back into place. The floor became still. The silence was absolute. The static man was gone. Elias pulled himself up, gasping for air, clutching the burn mark on his coat where the heat of the collapse had scorched the lining. He was covered in sweat and pain, but the wall was clean. He had destroyed the single constant of the third floor landing. He had removed the window. He knew what this meant. He had succeeded in introducing a massive, permanent variable into the house. Its physical structure. The house would try to reset it, but the memory of the sheer destruction, the energy needed to repair that kind of temporal damage, would strain the loop to its breaking point. He hurried back down to the foyer. He went to the grandfather clock. He looked at the base. The count was still there, but the number was carved with a desperate, frantic haste. The wood splintered around the digit. 6 of 30, the house had reset the foyer wall, but it had required so much power that it had failed to reset the destruction of the mirror on the third floor. It had just replaced the mirror with a wall, forcing the timeline back into conformity. Elias clutched the burn mark on his jacket. He had confirmation. The static man was an intelligent machine. It would now anticipate his actions and try to reset the environment with even more lethal purpose. He had to be completely different in cycle 6. He looked at his watch, 4 p.m. He had destroyed his escape route, but he had bought himself knowledge, and most importantly, time. The static man was weakened, and Elias was ready to take the fight to the engine itself. The loop snap was a concussion. Elias didn't just feel the tearing this time. He heard a massive, invisible gear grinding to a halt a foot above his head, followed by a wet, sickening slap. He landed on the driveway gravel hard. A breath knocked out of him. The air was heavy, smelling sharply of sulfur and burnt electronics. His watch displayed 4 p.m. He didn't. He needed to check his coat. The familiar stiff feel of the scorched lining and the heavy weight of Silas. His journal were constant reminders of the permanent damage he had inflicted on the house. The house could reset the environment, but it couldn't undo the consequences of his actions without a fight. 6 of 30, he stared at the oak door of Oakhaven. It looked less like a home entrance and more like a gullet. Cycle 6. Silence the chronometer. The metronome, Silas chronometer, was the heart of the loop. S rhythm. The static man had failed to stop him in the kitchen and failed to protect the third floor mirror. It was vulnerable, and Elias was going directly for the power source. He bypassed the letter, bypassed the clock, and marched straight to the sitting room. He grabbed the fireplace poker, his variable from cycle 3, and added a new tool, a heavy decorative iron fire grate. The grate was too large for him to hide in his coat, forcing the house to recognize its presence openly. He started up the stairs. The static echo was louder than ever, no longer whispers, but a fragmented symphony of failures. He is going up. Donda, let him. The ceiling is falling. I saw it fall. The blood, the voices were trying to trick him, to make him pause, look up, or lose his nerve. He focused on the rhythm of his own boots, on the worn steps, creating a mental shield. On the third floor landing, where the great mirror had hung, the house had done its best to conform. A perfectly smooth, freshly plastered section of wall now stood where the reflection had been. But the house repair was imperfect. The plaster was noticeably whiter and smoother than the surrounding aged walls, and the large burn mark on the wooden floor beneath it had only been partially bleached, remaining a faint, dark scar. Elias pressed his hand against the fresh plaster. It was colder than the rest of the wall, radiating a faint residual heat from the temporal discharge. He found the seam, confirming the house had kept the structural mechanism of the hidden room. Click. He slipped inside, the heavy iron grate clanking on the floor. The windowless room was unchanged, dominated by the motionless stack of notebooks and the high-backed chair. And on the table, the brass metronome stood, its housing polished and pristine. The room was filled with the terrible sound of the house. Its heartbeat talk, 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 slow, deep, and measured. The sound originated from the wall beneath the metronome, resonating through the wood. Elias approached the metronome, gripping the fireplace poker like a weapon. He had to assume the chronometer was protected. He lifted the brass housing. As in cycle 3, the space beneath was empty of any notes. But this time, the wood was split in a precise angular fissure beneath, where the metronome's feet rested. It wasn't a crack, it was a seam. He inserted the tip of the poker into the seam and leveraged his weight. The wood did not groan. It unzipped with a sound like tearing wet cloth. A section of the tabletop hinged upward, revealing a cavity below. This was the engine room. It wasn't a mechanical space. The cavity was lined with soft, pale, pulsating tissue, slick with clear, viscous fluid. In the center, sitting in this biological nest, was the true chronometer, a soft ball, sized sphere of black, dense material that looked like obsidian, but was strangely warm. The talk sound was coming from the sphere. It wasn't a ticking, it was the rhythmic expansion and contraction of the sphere, which shifted the surrounding fluid. Elias felt bile rise in his throat. The house wasn't running on clockwork, it was running on organism. He opened Silas' journal, his hands shaking, flipping through until he found a schematic scribbled across 2 pages. The core, the obsidian heart. It is not an instrument, it is a siphon. It synchronizes with the inhabitant's involuntary rhythms, fear, breath, terror, to stabilize the temporal field, to stop the cycle. You cannot destroy it. That may collapse the dimension entirely. You must synchronize it, feed it a rhythm it cannot process, a chaos that overwhelms the beat. Silas had drawn a crude diagram next to the text, the obsidian sphere, and beside it, a series of smaller, vibrating nodes. The sensors. Elias looked back into the cavity. Surrounding the pulsating obsidian core were 4 tiny, white, fleshy nodules. They pulsed with a faint, static charge. These were the antennas. The white hair from cycle 4 wasn't just an intrusion. It was the static man leaving a part of the mechanism outside the engine room, trying to harvest his terror up close. Elias pulled the fireplace poker free and used his knife, which he retrieved and kept in his pocket from the first cycle, to scrape away the tissue around one of the sensor nodules. The tissue felt strangely resilient, like old leather. As the knife made contact, the talk of the core ceased. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. Elias felt his own heart skip a beat, the sudden lack of rhythm disorienting him completely. Then, The static man reacted. The door to the hidden room, the one Elias had carefully closed, slammed open with a violent crack that echoed the dimensional snap. The static man stood silhouetted in the doorway, but it was no longer a flicker of light. It was solidifying, its light, composed form taking on the density of black glass. Its whisper was not in his mind, but a raw tearing sound in the air. You will not break the rhythm. It is the only thing keeping it whole. The static man lunged, its skeletal black glass hand reaching for the metronome table. Elias had seconds. He had to introduce chaos. He grabbed the heavy iron fire grate. He didn't use it as a weapon. He raised it high and smashed it down onto the round table beside the metronome. The force of the impact shattered the table, but the metronome, attached only to the hinged flap, remained intact. The notebooks flew across the room. Elias grabbed the obsidian core with his gloved hand. It was intensely hot, scalding even through the leather. He scrambled away from the lunging static man, the pulsing core burning into his palm. He ran to the nearest corner of the room, pulling a small, heavy piece of stone from the pocket of his trousers. A random object he had picked up from the driveway gravel. In a previous cycle, he shoved the obsidian core into the mouth of the bronze metronome housing, wedging it in place. Then, using the piece of gravel, he began to furiously scratch a pattern onto the brass housing. Not a word, not a number, but a chaotic, random series of intersecting lines and angles, creating a visual, tactile form of anti-rhythm. The static man was closing in, its shape stretching, its light, black arm morphing into a grasping sickle. As Elias finished the last scratch, the obsidian core within the metronome gave off a blinding flash of purple energy. The metronome did not tick. Instead, it began to emit a rapid, maddening stutter. T-T-Talk, T-T-T-Talk, T-To-Talk. A sequence that was physically impossible for a metronome to produce. The stuttering sound hit the static man like a physical blow. The black, glass figure staggered backward, convulsing. Its form began to pixelate, the solid glass turning back into flickering white noise. Chaos! No! The entity screamed, its voice breaking apart into the 1,000 agonizing static echoes. He burst out of the hidden room, leaving the damaged, stuttering chronometer behind. He slammed the secret panel shut. He flew down the stairs. The entire house was vibrating violently, not humming, but shuddering. Walls groaned. The ceiling plaster cracked and rained dust. He reached the foyer, gasping. He glanced at the clock. The second hand was no longer frozen at 3:07. It was shaking, desperately trying to move, but being jerked back and forth by the stuttering anti-rhythm of the metronome. Elias stumbled toward the front door. He could, not to look back. He just knew the snap was imminent. He reached the door, pulled it open, and fell out onto the driveway. He turned just as the white light erupted from Oakhaven, not the soft glow of a reset, but a violent solar flare of energy. The light slammed into him, knocking him unconscious as the world tore itself apart. He woke up on the gravel. He checked his coat. The journal and the scorched lining were there. He was alive. He walked to the clock, his body aching. The count was deeply, irrevocably carved into the wood, and the splinters around it were darker now, saturated with energy. 7 of 30 he had survived, but the house was structurally damaged and infuriated. He had thrown the house's rhythm into a state of chaotic stutter. The static man was weakened, but undoubtedly planning a devastating counterattack. What will Elias find when he returns to the 3rd floor in Cycle 7? Now that the metronome is stuttering, the transition from Cycle 6 to Cycle 7 was not a snap, or a lurch, but a complete system crash. Elias didn't. He wake up immediately. He experienced a brief, agonizing instant of non-existence, a silence so complete that his consciousness felt like a ghost detached from its anchor. Then came the reboot. He found himself lying on the driveway gravel, his limbs twitching violently, his body racked by involuntary spasms. The familiar, deep blue twilight of 4 p.m. was fractured, flickering at the edges like a broken video file. The air smelled of ozone and damp dirt. He hauled himself up, his muscles screaming. The sound of the house was maddening. The chronometer, the obsidian core wedged in the metronome, was still sending out its chaotic, broken rhythm. T-T-Talk, T-T-T-Talk. The sound wasn't just noise. It felt like a physical vibration inside his skull, trying to unscrew his very thoughts. He checked his coat. The journals were there, scorched and secured. He was alive. He walked to the foyer, ignoring the rhythmic thrum of pain in his head. The sight that greeted him confirmed the house was in severe temporal decay. The grandfather clock was running, but the pendulum was swinging twice as fast as it should, rattling against the glass. The sealed letter on the side table was not neat. The corner was crumpled, as if the house had tried to reset it, but missed the mark. He reached the base of the clock. The tally was there, carved with a desperate, hurried effort, the wood around it looking frayed and dry. 7 of 30, the house had successfully logged the cycle, but it was visibly suffering. Cycle 7, locate compressed knowledge. The chaotic rhythm had to be affecting the house's ability to compress and hide information. Elias needed more of Silas's knowledge before the static man repaired the engine room. He headed straight for the library. The static echo was no longer a chorus of screams, but a fractured, repeating soundbite. The door is not. The door is not. Door is not. The sound clipped off constantly, stuttering in time with the metronome. The library itself was a catalog of glitches. Bookshelves were tilted at slight, impossible angles. A line of biographies on one shelf had been replaced by an identical set of dictionaries, a small, meaningless substitution that spoke volumes about the house's failing precision. Elias went to the spot where he found the first journal behind the Latin texts. The shelf had reset, but not perfectly. A single, dark seam, a line where the wood failed to connect cleanly with the wall, ran vertically down the panel. He ran his knife along the seam. The panel didn't swing open. It dissolved inward, with a sound like tearing cellophane. Behind the panel was a compartment holding not one, but 3 more journals, stacked neatly. They were smaller, bound in simple cloth, labeled with only numbers. I, 3rd. Elias grabbed them and shoved them into his coat. He kept journal, eye out, desperate for immediate insight into his current, unstable situation. He opened it to the middle, where Silas's neat script suddenly degraded into frantic, scrawled capitals. Entry, Cycle 28, the breakdown. I was wrong about the purpose of the 30. It is not stabilization, it is compression. The obsidian core uses the rhythmic tension of the loop to compress the inhabitant's consciousness into a single, dense point of energy. At C-30, the compression is complete, and the soul is absorbed by the chronometer, becoming the static man's new operating code. The static echo is the residue of the failed attempts. The uncompressed screams. The only way to stop this is to introduce death. Compression, chaos. My final journal entry, the one I placed in the basement crypt, is misleading. It only provides the first step. The true solution is outside the loop, S reach, in the gazebo on the property. S edge. I left the key there. I must be quick. The static man knows. I'm writing this. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his chest, far worse than the fear of the entity. His grandfather hadn't intended to trap him. He had been sacrificing himself to provide a roadmap, a way out that was split across multiple cycles and multiple locations to bypass the house. His immediate reset ability, the key to the final step, the escape, was outside the house, in the gazebo. He looked up, suddenly aware of the heightened, glitching atmosphere. The low light from the library window was not steady. It was shimmering and breaking into red and blue lines, like light passing through a prism. And then he saw it, but it wasn't T1 solid figure. It was 7 or 8 faint, overlapping silhouettes composed of fractured light, scattered around the library. They were trying to converge, trying to solidify into the menacing black, glass shape from Cycle 6, but the metronome, S chaotic TT, talk, was holding them apart. It was data fragmentation. The static man was the house, S code, and the chaotic rhythm was making it impossible for the code to compile a single form. One of the fragments, shimmering near a bookcase, managed to force out a piece of conscious thought, a raw electronic pulse in Elias' mind. You read the code. You understand the function. That makes you dangerous, Elias. That makes you the ultimate variable. The fragment lunged, but instead of physical contact, it simply glitched backward 3 feet, pulled by the stuttering rhythm. Elias didn't hesitate. He jammed the new journals into his coat. The library was a tomb of information, and the static man was still too fragmented to stop him from taking it. He needed the key in the gazebo, but he had to get there before the house could repair its rhythm. He burst out of the library and ran toward the back of the house, heading for the kitchen door that led to the gardens. As he ran, the instability became overwhelming. The floor beneath his feet began to change. The wood warred with its own reset. Patches of smooth, polished floor would instantly become dusty, cracked cement, only to snap back to wood a second later. This was temporal bleed in the environment itself. The rhythm was so broken that the house could decide which cycle as architecture to adhere to. He reached the kitchen and flung open the back door. The garden was dark, choked with overgrown, dead rhododendrons. He located the gazebo, a wrought iron structure draped in dead vines, looming eerily at the far edge of the property boundary. It looked miles away in the fractured twilight. Elias stopped, turning to look back at the house, a monument of temporal insanity. The high window where the light had burst in Cycle 5 was now not one window, but 3 overlapping windows showing slightly different light sources in each frame. The static echo came in one single, coherent thought, loud and terrified. I am repairing. I am stabilizing. You will not survive Cycle 8, Ilias. I will burn the code that saves you. Ilias smiled grimly, tasting copper in his mouth. He clutched the journals. You can try, he whispered, stepping out into the garden. But you are stuttering, and I know where the key is. He plunged into the dead foliage, heading for the gazebo. The white light of the final reset was already beginning to bloom behind the windows of Oakhaven. Elias is now racing against a damaged, enraged, but rapidly repairing entity. He has the next step, the gazebo, but is exposing himself outside the main structure for the first time. Would you like to continue to Chapter 8, which will focus on his dangerous sprint to the gazebo? and the challenge of finding the key while the house resets